Story 1. Possible Jersey Devil Sighting. I've seen quite a few things that I have a hard time explaining. In case I submit any other stories, I'll just give you some background information now. My father served in the military. He was descended from a Native American tribe from up north, was a survivalist, and a complete psychopath that forced his sons into intense survival scenarios and then left us for weeks on end to see if we'd survive. I've seen some truly disturbing things during these camping trips, and some things in less stressful settings. Anyway, I'll get on with the sighting. I was 11. I had just moved back to America less than a week before. My family had decided to take a short road trip up to Maine to visit some relatives when we went off course. Being 11 and naive enough to think I would actually make it to Maine before my father did anything stupid, I didn't pay attention when he pulled off onto a back road. To this day, I do not know where I was dropped off at, just that it was a dense, forested area. I think it was in New York, but I can't say for certain. Anyway, I was unexpectedly kicked out of the car after being handed my canteen, bow, compass, and knife. I was told that they'd be back after visiting family, and that I'd have 15 days out there in the woods. I did the basic survival stuff, found drinkable water, built shelter, plotted out a rough map of the area in my head, all of that stuff. It was my third or fourth night there when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming. Since mountain lions didn't come out this far east and bears were easy to scare away if it was one, I figured I'd go investigate in case it was an injured hiker or something. After following the sound, all that I could find was a squirrel that had been partially eaten. The only thing I could figure is that someone came across the dead squirrel, had screamed at the sight of it, then left after calming down. So I went back to my shelter and settled in for the night. After that first incident, the screaming became a nightly occurrence, and after the third night of not finding anything aside from evidence of a predator in the area, I decided to play it safe and stay in my shelter at night. 2 days before my family would be back where I was dropped off at, I awoke in the middle of the night to screaming right outside my shelter. I jumped out, bow in one hand, my knife and arrow in the other. What I saw terrified me. It was about the size of a dog, but shaped like a deer. It had a very humanoid face and was covered in dull, dark scales. I panicked and shot it in the chest. It began hissing and wheezing as it ran off into the trees. I had thought about following it and killing it. But when I looked at its tracks, I saw something that convinced me otherwise. The creature's hind legs left behind the tracks of a small deer. The front legs, however, left the tracks you'd see from a person walking on their hands like a gorilla, only the fingers ended with sharp claw marks scratching up the earth while it moved. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night, and on the following morning, I dug several holes around my camp, filled them with sharpened stakes, and covered them. I also did my squirrel hunting and harvested berries as fast as I could once my defenses were up, so that I wouldn't need to worry about losing my strength if that thing came back. I didn't sleep that night, despite the fact that nothing happened. In the morning, I carved a simple warning into the trees around my camp that just said, "Danger, traps," and left. I didn't let go of my bow until after I was picked up and we had been driving for over an hour. To this day, I still can't find an explanation for what I saw. Story 2. The Mothman. You will never believe what I saw one very cold, dry November night. My family and I moved into a new house up on a hill on a little back road in a very small town of Fort Gay, West Virginia. Fort Gay sits right on the east side of Kentucky. The population of my town then was probably just a couple thousand. My family and I were unpacking. We had not yet put the furniture in its rightful places, and everything was still in boxes. Overwhelmed with working all day, I retired around 11 p.m. I put my little brother on the couch, and I took his bed, since my bed wasn't put together yet. His room faces the front of the house. His window is around 20 to 25 feet or so off the ground. I was looking outside when I saw it. It stood about 7 feet tall. I had no idea what it was, but I was frozen. I had never been that scared in all my life. All I could do was lay there and just stare at this thing. It was sitting in a tree about 50 feet or so off the ground, about 50 feet from the house across the yard. It felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. It had big, red, bright, glowing eyes looking dead into my face. I finally worked up enough courage to close my eyes and put my head under the covers, when all of a sudden, this thing smacked against the window. I went through the house screaming, "There's something outside! There's something outside!" My mom and dad looked at me and said, "What's wrong with you? It looks like you've seen a ghost." My face was now snow white. I said, "I don't know what it was, but please, Daddy, don't go outside." I begged and begged. He came back in and said there was nothing out there. I kept screaming, saying, "Yes, there is! Yes, there is!" When I explained to them what I saw and how I felt, they said I was crazy. But to this day, I will not go outside by myself, and even in the day, someone still has to walk me to my car. I've heard of some pretty crazy things going on that road, but I never expected to experience anything myself. My husband and I went to the theater and watched Mothman Prophecies. I was reliving that night all over again. The way they described the feeling and what I saw was remarkable. My husband looked over at me and said, "Isn't that what you described to me when we first started dating?" I couldn't say a word. After that moment, I knew what I saw. I believe in all heart of hearts, I saw the Mothman. It's just a little weird. I only live about 80 miles south of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where all that took place 37 years ago. It was exactly 32 years to the month when I saw it. Story 3. Dogman versus Game Warden. I'd like to tell you my cryptid story, but I'd like to start by apologizing for any spelling or grammar errors, due to it being 4 in the morning as I'm writing this. Anyway, one night dispatch tells me I'm being requested for a missing person and to hurry over. So I tell them okay and head my way over to the area I'm needed. As I pull up, David and one of my other co-workers, who we will call Mike, are getting the AR-15 ready. I get out as David walks up and says, "It's pretty serious. You better go talk to the person's family before I do." I tell him okay and walk to the house where the family lets me in. The father tells me him and his 8-year-old son were out squirrel hunting. He had just turned around to relieve himself when he hears his son screaming. He glanced back behind him to see his son being carried away by someone big and hairy. At first I didn't know what to think, and I tell my partners I'm calling BS on this story. But they tell me they've already been looking for the kid and are scared he's been killed by a bear. Even though bears are not common, they are not unheard of where we're from. I say okay and get Phoenix all ready to go, and we head out into the woods. At first, Phoenix wasn't getting anything at all, and then all of a sudden he begins to whimper and move back and forth. Then the whimpering turns into growling, and he backs up to me and starts to bark. I tell him to calm down, and for the most part he does. "Calm down, boy. Calm down. It's all right." But then I hear, "We got something big," from Mike. I look up, and about 10 yards in front of us, this little boy runs out with his clothes ripped and bleeding. I grabbed him to take a closer look, and other than him crying and a few cuts, he seemed to be okay. I look at Mike laughing and say, "Yeah, he's real big." I then look back at the kid, and he is pointing in the same direction he came from. And I hear him say under his breath, "They are coming." I look at him and ask, "Who? Who's coming?" I then hear my dog start to bark again, and David screams, "Holy!" I look up and see this big wolf-like thing, maybe 7 yards away, looking at me and growling. My dog lunges forward, but I pull the leash and scream, "No!" We slowly back up. When we back up, this thing stands on 2 legs and starts to walk away from us. We didn't know what to do other than run. Everyone acted casual when we got back to the house, as if nothing had happened, though deep down, I'm pretty sure all of us were a bit frightened. A little while later, Mike and David said they were leaving the area and heading home. I give them the okay, and they head out as I'm talking to the father, telling him about what happened. I ask him what he thinks we saw, and he goes on to tell me he doesn't know if they're werewolves or skinwalkers, but they've been there long before they lived on the property. I talk to him a little longer and then head out. As I'm driving, I notice a dark figure standing in the middle of the road. I think it's just a drunk guy, but as I get closer, I notice this isn't a human. It's the same thing me and my partner saw in the woods with the little boy. I come to a complete stop and make eye contact with this thing. At this point, I'm not scared, just curious. So I do something stupid and start to open my door. All of a sudden, my dog starts going nuts. I look to my right and see the exact same thing standing in front of me. I then look to my left and see another one. I think to myself, "Oh crap, I'm gonna be killed." But that's when this thing just walks off the side of the road and leaves. Confused and bewildered, I head home, ready to take a nice long vacation. I never talked about that day until one time David and I were out shooting clay pigeons, and I asked him what he thinks we saw. He looked at me and told me that the family moved only days after that happened, and no one has bought the property due to rumors of big dogs running around. I asked if he believed in that type of stuff or not, and he says, "I've seen a lot of messed up things in my life, but that's by far the creepiest thing I've ever seen, and I don't want to ever talk about it again. It makes me wonder what's really out there in the woods."